Some people decide where you belong before they learn who you are. The words would not be spoken until much later, but the lesson began the moment Lauren Mitchell looked across the first-class lounge and decided Malcolm Hayes did not belong there. The lounge overlooked the airport through walls of glass stretching nearly 30 feet high. Afternoon sunlight poured across polished floors and leather chairs. Business travelers reviewed presentations. Families waited quietly for departures. Airline employees moved through the room with practiced efficiency. Everything felt calm, predictable, exclusive. Malcolm sat near the windows with a laptop open in front of him and a cup of coffee resting beside the keyboard. He wore a simple charcoal jacket, dark jeans, and comfortable travel shoes. Nothing flashy, nothing designed to attract attention. He looked like a man focused on work while waiting for a flight. Lauren noticed him the moment she entered the lounge. At first, she simply glanced in his direction. Then she glanced again, then a third time. Something about him seemed out of place to her. Or at least that was what she convinced herself. She selected a seat across the room but continued watching him. Malcolm never appeared to notice. His attention remained fixed on a financial report displayed on his screen. A few minutes passed. Then Lauren stood and walked toward the coffee station located near Malcolm's table. Several travelers occupied nearby chairs. Conversations drifted softly through the room. The atmosphere remained relaxed until Lauren spoke. "Excuse me," she said loudly enough for multiple people to hear. Malcolm looked up politely. "Yes." Lauren crossed her arms. "You do not belong in first class." The words landed like a dropped glass. Nearby conversations stopped immediately. Heads turned. A businessman lowered his tablet. An older couple exchanged surprised looks. Even a lounge attendant paused briefly while organizing refreshments. Malcolm blinked once. Not because he was shocked, more because he seemed curious. "I am sorry," he asked calmly. Lauren gestured toward the lounge around them. "This area is reserved for premium travelers." Malcolm maintained the same calm expression. "I am aware." Lauren nodded as though she had proven something. "Then you understand my concern." Malcolm closed his laptop halfway and studied her for a moment. His face revealed nothing. No anger. No embarrassment. No frustration. "Actually," he said, "I do not." Several people nearby shifted uncomfortably. The businessman who had lowered his tablet now watched openly. Lauren appeared surprised by Malcolm's composure. She seemed to expect defensiveness. Instead, she found patience. That only made her more confident. "I have traveled first class for years," she said. "You can usually tell who belongs here." A silence followed. It stretched across the lounge like a wire pulled tight. Malcolm glanced briefly around the room. Dozens of strangers were watching now. Some appeared uncomfortable. Others appeared curious. A few seemed willing to accept Lauren's judgment without question. Malcolm had seen that look before, more times than he could count. "And how exactly do you tell?" he asked quietly. Lauren opened her mouth, but hesitated. The question sounded simple, yet answering it suddenly felt more difficult than she expected. Before she could respond, another traveler nearby looked away awkwardly. Someone else pretended to check a phone. The tension in the lounge grew heavier. Lauren finally straightened her shoulders. "You know exactly what I mean." Malcolm nodded slowly. "Yes," he said. "I think I do." The answer unsettled her more than an argument would have. Across the room, a lounge employee noticed the growing attention and began walking toward them. Around them, travelers continued watching. Nobody realized that the quiet man sitting beside the window was about to change the entire atmosphere of the lounge. For now, however, Malcolm Hayes simply reopened his laptop and returned his attention to work while Lauren remained standing beside him, convinced she had identified someone who did not belong. What she did not know was that before the afternoon ended, everyone in that room would be forced to reconsider what belonging actually meant. Lauren Mitchell expected Malcolm Hayes to react. That was what unsettled her most. She had delivered a public challenge in the middle of an exclusive airport lounge, yet the man she targeted simply returned to his work. No argument. No raised voice. No attempt to convince anyone. Malcolm reopened his laptop and continued reviewing financial reports as though the interruption had been nothing more than a brief change in the weather. Lauren remained standing beside him. The silence felt uncomfortable. Around the lounge, travelers pretended to return to their own activities, but nobody truly did. The businessman near the espresso machine still watched over the edge of his tablet. The older couple near the windows whispered quietly to each other. Several passengers glanced up every few seconds. The room had become a stage, and everyone knew another scene was coming. Lauren folded her arms. You were just going to ignore what I said. Malcolm looked up calmly. I heard what you said. Then you should respond. Why? The question caught her off guard. Lauren blinked. Because I made a valid point. Malcolm studied her expression for a moment. Did you? The answer was delivered so gently that it almost sounded like curiosity rather than disagreement. That made it more effective. Lauren felt the attention of the room pressing against her. She had expected support. Instead, she was beginning to feel exposed. A lounge attendant named Sarah approached with a professional smile. Good afternoon, she said. Is everything all right here? Lauren answered before Malcolm could speak. I was simply trying to understand whether everyone in this lounge actually belongs here. Sarah's smile tightened slightly. All guests admitted to the lounge have valid access. Lauren glanced toward Malcolm. That is exactly what I was trying to determine. Sarah turned toward Malcolm. Sir, is everything okay? Malcolm nodded. Everything is fine. The answer surprised Sarah. It surprised several passengers too. Most people in his position would have immediately explained the situation. Malcolm chose not to. He seemed completely comfortable allowing events to unfold on their own. Sarah looked between them before excusing herself. Yet even after she left, the atmosphere remained tense. Lauren returned to her seat across the room, but she did not stop watching him. In fact, Malcolm's calmness appeared to make her even more suspicious. Every few minutes, she glanced toward him. Every few minutes, she found him doing exactly the same thing. Working, reading, occasionally taking a sip of coffee. Nothing more. Nearly 20 minutes passed. The lounge settled into an uneasy rhythm. Then the whispers began. A man near the buffet quietly commented to another traveler. A woman checking flight updates looked toward Malcolm before speaking softly to her companion. The details differed, but the pattern remained the same. People were creating explanations without evidence. Some assumed Malcolm had entered the wrong lounge. Others assumed he had somehow received access through a mistake. Very few considered a simpler possibility, that he belonged exactly where he was. Malcolm noticed the whispers. He had experienced versions of them throughout his life. The locations changed. The assumptions remained remarkably consistent. Across the room, Lauren seemed encouraged by the growing attention. She interpreted the whispers as agreement. Validation. Proof that other people saw what she believed she saw. What she failed to realize was that the room had begun changing in another way as well. Several travelers were no longer questioning Malcolm. They were questioning her. They had watched the entire exchange. One person remained calm. The other seemed determined to prove a stranger did not belong. That contrast was becoming impossible to ignore. Then something happened that nobody expected. Near the reception desk, a lounge employee entered information into the system while glancing repeatedly toward Malcolm. A moment later, the employee's expression changed completely. Confusion became surprise. Surprise became concern. Within seconds, the employee picked up a phone and quietly contacted someone. Across the lounge, Malcolm continued working without looking up. He already sensed the shift. Lauren did not. She remained focused on the story she had created. What she could not see was that somewhere behind the scenes, a single name had just appeared on a screen. And that name was about to change the entire room. The lounge had quietly divided itself into sides. Nobody announced it. Nobody voted. Yet the moment Malcolm Hayes became the subject of speculation, people began choosing positions. Some believed Lauren Mitchell had identified a problem. Others believed she had created one. Most sat somewhere in the middle, watching carefully while building private conclusions from incomplete information. Malcolm remained seated near the windows with his laptop open. The afternoon sunlight reflected softly across the screen as he reviewed documents and occasionally typed a few notes. To anyone arriving fresh into the lounge, he appeared completely unaware that he had become the center of attention. In reality, he noticed everything. The glances, the whispers, the subtle shifts in body language. Experience had taught him that public judgment often arrived long before facts. Across the room, Lauren watched him with growing frustration. She expected discomfort. She expected embarrassment. What she received instead was patience. The difference bothered her more than she wanted to admit. A businessman seated nearby finally spoke to another traveler. Maybe the staff already checked his credentials. The other traveler shrugged. Maybe. But if everything was normal, why is everyone talking about it? That question spread quietly through the lounge. People often mistook attention for evidence. The more a story circulated, the more believable it seemed. Lauren appeared encouraged by the growing conversation. She interpreted curiosity as agreement. "I am only saying what everyone else is thinking," she remarked loudly from her chair. Several people immediately looked away. Nobody volunteered support. The absence of agreement seemed to surprise her. Malcolm continued working. The older couple near the window exchanged thoughtful glances. "He seems awfully calm," the woman whispered. Her husband nodded. People usually become defensive when they know they are wrong. The observation lingered. More passengers began noticing the same thing. Malcolm never argued, never complained, never demanded validation. He simply behaved like someone who belonged exactly where he was. Near the reception desk, the employee who had made the phone call earlier remained unusually focused on a computer screen. Every few minutes, the employee glanced toward Malcolm and then back to the monitor. Another staff member joined them. A brief conversation followed. Their expressions revealed concern, but not the kind Lauren expected. This concern seemed directed inward, as though they feared a mistake had already been made. Malcolm noticed the activity without reacting. Lauren noticed it and reached an entirely different conclusion. "See," she said to nobody in particular. "Even the staff knows something is not right." Yet confidence no longer spread through the room the way it had earlier. Too many people had watched the situation unfold. Too many had noticed who remained composed and who continued fueling the tension. The lounge attendant Sarah returned to the reception area and quietly reviewed information on a tablet. Moments later, her eyes widened slightly. She looked toward Malcolm. Then she immediately walked into a staff-only office. The businessman who had been observing from the beginning lowered his tablet completely. "Something just changed," he said. The older woman nodded. She sensed it too. Around the lounge, conversations gradually faded. People could feel momentum shifting, even if they did not yet understand why. Lauren sat forward in her chair. Malcolm finally closed his laptop and looked out through the enormous glass windows overlooking the runway. Aircraft moved beneath the afternoon sun while distant departures climbed into the sky. He seemed completely relaxed. Then the office door near reception opened. A senior manager stepped into the lounge carrying a company tablet. The manager scanned the room only once before locking eyes on Malcolm Hayes. And in that instant, several people realized the story they had spent the last hour believing might be completely wrong. The senior manager moved through the lounge with the kind of urgency that immediately captured attention. His name tag identified him as David Mercer, Regional Guest Experience Director. Most travelers had never seen him before, but the reaction from the staff made it clear he was not someone who normally handled routine concerns. Sarah straightened the moment he approached. The reception employees stopped what they were doing. Even the atmosphere of the lounge seemed to shift around him. David carried a company tablet in one hand and a concerned expression on his face. Yet what surprised everyone was where he walked. He did not approach Lauren Mitchell. He did not gather information from the staff. He headed directly toward Malcolm Hayes. The businessman near the espresso station noticed it first, then the older couple, then nearly everyone else. Conversations faded. The lounge became quiet enough to hear the soft wheels of a suitcase rolling across the marble floor in the distance. Lauren watched closely. She expected validation. She expected David to confirm what she had been saying all afternoon. Instead, the manager stopped beside Malcolm and offered a respectful smile. "Mr. Hayes," he said, "thank you for waiting." Several passengers exchanged confused looks. Malcolm closed his laptop and nodded politely. "Good afternoon." David seemed genuinely relieved. "I apologize for the interruption to your travel experience." Lauren immediately stood. "Excuse me," she said. "Are we finally going to verify whether he belongs here?" David turned toward her. For a brief moment, he appeared surprised by the question. Not offended, simply surprised. "Mr. Hayes has full lounge access," he replied. The answer landed heavily across the room. Lauren blinked. Then why was everyone making phone calls? David glanced at the tablet in his hand. "Because we wanted to ensure everything was handled correctly." The response only deepened the confusion. Around the lounge, people began reevaluating what they thought they knew. Malcolm remained calm. He had not changed. The room around him had. Lauren folded her arms. There must be more to it than that. David paused. His expression suggested he was choosing his words carefully. "There is." A ripple moved through the crowd. Even Sarah looked curious. David turned back toward Malcolm. "Sir, our executive office has already been notified." The statement immediately caught everyone's attention. Executive office. Those two words carried weight. The businessman lowered his tablet completely. The older woman leaned forward in her chair. Lauren stared at David. "Executive office?" she repeated. David nodded. "Yes." Malcolm offered a faint smile. "That seems unnecessary." David actually laughed softly. "With respect, sir," they disagreed. Several people noticed the familiarity in his tone. This was not how staff typically spoke to ordinary travelers. The realization spread quietly through the room. Lauren noticed it too. For the first time all afternoon, uncertainty appeared on her face. David glanced toward the entrance of the lounge before checking a message that had just appeared on his tablet. The moment he read it, his posture changed. Not panic, not concern, anticipation. He looked back at Malcolm. "They are already on their way." Malcolm nodded as though he expected nothing less. Around them, dozens of travelers sat silently, trying to understand what was happening. Nobody had answers yet. They only knew one thing. The story that began with assumptions was moving toward a truth far larger than anyone expected. And somewhere beyond the lounge doors, a senior executive was now walking quickly through the airport because of one man sitting quietly beside the window. As the lounge settled into an uneasy silence, Malcolm Hayes leaned back slightly in his chair and looked through the massive glass windows overlooking the runway. Outside, aircraft taxied beneath the fading afternoon sun. Inside, dozens of strangers waited for answers. Yet Malcolm appeared completely unaffected by the attention surrounding him. The scene reminded him of another airport many years earlier. Another lounge. Another room filled with people who thought they knew where he belonged. For a moment, his thoughts drifted backward. He remembered being 24 years old, carrying a worn briefcase and a single suit he could barely afford. Back then, every business trip felt like a test. Not because of the meetings, because of the assumptions. He remembered walking into luxury hotels and being mistaken for delivery staff. He remembered attending conferences where people handed him coats because they assumed he worked there. He remembered being asked whether he was in the correct meeting room moments before giving the keynote presentation. The details changed. The pattern never did. At first, those experiences frustrated him. Then they motivated him. Eventually, they taught him something far more valuable. Success could change a person's circumstances, but it did not automatically change other people's assumptions. The only thing he could control was his response. That lesson became one of the foundations of his career. While others rushed to prove themselves, Malcolm learned the power of patience. Truth eventually arrived on its own schedule. Across the lounge, Lauren Mitchell sat quietly for the first time all afternoon. The confidence that had fueled her earlier comments seemed weaker now. She kept glancing toward Malcolm, then toward David Mercer, then toward the entrance. Every answer she expected had created new questions instead. Around the room, other travelers experienced something similar. Earlier, many had been comfortable making assumptions. Now they were forced to confront uncertainty. The businessman near the espresso station finally spoke to the older woman sitting nearby. "I think we all got this wrong." She nodded slowly. "Maybe the real story was never what we thought it was." Malcolm overheard neither comment. He was focused on a message that had appeared on his laptop screen. After reading it, he smiled faintly and closed the computer. Whatever information he received seemed reassuring. Calm. Familiar. David Mercer noticed. "Everything okay, sir?" he asked. Malcolm nodded. "Everything is fine." The answer sounded simple. Yet David looked relieved. Once again, the interaction felt unusual. Staff members did not normally seek reassurance from travelers. The lounge doors opened briefly as new passengers entered. A few looked around, sensed the tension, and immediately realized they had arrived in the middle of something. Nobody needed an explanation. The atmosphere explained enough. Then David's company tablet vibrated. He glanced down. His expression changed immediately. The anticipation returned. He straightened his tie and looked toward the entrance. "They are here," he said quietly. Several nearby passengers heard him. The words spread through the room without anyone repeating them. Heads turned toward the doors. Conversation stopped. Even Lauren rose slightly from her seat. Malcolm remained calm. The same calm he carried through every assumption, every judgment, and every challenge life had placed before him. Because unlike everyone else in the lounge, He already knew who was about to walk through those doors. And within the next few minutes, the story everyone believed they understood would begin to unravel completely. The lounge doors opened, and every conversation in the room stopped. People turned instinctively toward the entrance, sensing that whatever came next would finally explain the unusual chain of events unfolding throughout the afternoon. A man in a tailored Navy suit stepped inside, accompanied by two senior airport executives. His name was Robert Sinclair, president of passenger experience for the airline group. Most travelers did not recognize him, but the staff certainly did. The moment he entered, employees straightened their posture. Conversations among staff ceased entirely. Robert scanned the lounge only once before immediately spotting Malcolm Hayes near the windows. Without hesitation, he walked directly toward him. The reaction was impossible to ignore. Lauren Mitchell watched closely. So did the businessman near the espresso station. So did the older couple by the glass wall. Every person who had spent the afternoon forming opinions suddenly found themselves paying attention to a very different set of facts. Robert arrived at Malcolm's table and extended his hand with a warm smile. "Mr. Hayes," he said, "I am very sorry this happened." Malcolm stood and shook his hand. "Good to see you again, Robert." The familiarity between them instantly transformed the room. This was not a customer meeting an executive. This was something else entirely. Robert looked genuinely concerned. "We should have prevented this situation from developing." Malcolm smiled calmly. "I assure you, everything is fine." Robert laughed softly. "You always say that." Several passengers exchanged confused glances. Lauren felt her confidence slipping further away. The conversation sounded personal, familiar, respectful. Nothing about it matched the story she had been telling herself since entering the lounge. Robert turned briefly toward David Mercer. "Has everything been reviewed?" David nodded immediately. "Yes, sir." Robert glanced back at Malcolm. "Good." The businessman who had spent the afternoon observing quietly lowered his tablet completely. The older woman folded her hands together and smiled faintly. She sensed what many others were beginning to suspect. Malcolm Hayes was not merely an important traveler. He was someone far more significant. Robert pulled out a chair, but remained standing instead. "The board was informed as soon as your name appeared in the escalation report." Several nearby passengers heard every word. "Board. Escalation report. Informed immediately." Each phrase added another piece to a puzzle nobody could yet fully see. Malcolm shook his head slightly. "That was unnecessary." "Perhaps," Robert replied. "But some people become nervous when they discover who the report involves." A few staff members smiled awkwardly. The statement sounded honest. Lauren stared at Malcolm. For the first time all afternoon, she seemed completely unsure what to think. Earlier, she believed she understood exactly who he was. Now she realized she knew nothing at all. Around the lounge, attention shifted away from Malcolm's appearance and toward the respect being shown to him. Respect was difficult to fake. It revealed itself naturally. The way people spoke, the way they listened, the way they reacted when someone entered a room. Robert finally glanced around the lounge and noticed the number of passengers watching. He understood immediately. News traveled quickly in places like this. Assumptions traveled even faster. He looked back at Malcolm with a thoughtful expression. "I suppose everyone is wondering why so many executives suddenly appeared." Malcolm smiled. "That would be a reasonable question." Robert nodded. Then he took a slow breath and looked around the room. The moment had arrived. Within seconds, the truth behind Malcolm Hayes would begin emerging into the open. And once it did, nothing about the afternoon would look the same again. The entire lounge seemed to lean forward at the same time. Travelers who had spent the last hour pretending not to watch finally stopped pretending. Business calls were forgotten. Coffee cups sat untouched. Even the staff appeared unusually attentive. Everyone sensed that the answer was finally coming. Robert Sinclair looked around the room for a moment before returning his attention to Malcolm Hayes. The respect in his expression was impossible to miss. It was not the respect given to a loyal customer. It was the respect reserved for someone whose influence reached far beyond a boarding pass or a lounge membership. Lauren Mitchell noticed it. So did everyone else. Robert smiled. "Mr. Hayes has always preferred to travel quietly," he said. "In fact, most people who meet him have no idea who he is." Several passengers glanced toward Malcolm. He appeared completely comfortable with the statement. "That has always been the goal," Malcolm replied. Soft laughter came from a few employees who clearly knew him well. The exchange only deepened the mystery. Robert nodded. Unfortunately, quiet success sometimes creates interesting situations. A few people smiled nervously. Lauren did not. Her expression remained fixed on Malcolm. She seemed to be searching for an explanation that would make the afternoon make sense again. Robert took a slow breath. I think there may be some confusion about why our executive office became involved. Nobody spoke. Nobody needed to. The question hung over the entire lounge. Robert continued. The reason is simple. Whenever Mr. Hayes appears in an executive report, senior leadership is notified immediately. The statement produced another wave of confusion. Senior leadership. Immediate notification. Those were not words associated with ordinary travelers. The businessman near the espresso station exchanged a glance with the older woman. Both seemed to arrive at the same conclusion. Malcolm was far more important than anyone had imagined. Robert looked toward Malcolm. You know we have that policy because of you. Malcolm smiled faintly. I remember. The familiarity between them transformed the atmosphere again. Lauren lowered her eyes briefly before looking back up. For the first time all afternoon, uncertainty had completely replaced confidence. She was no longer trying to prove Malcolm did not belong. She was trying to understand who he really was. Around the lounge, travelers replayed the day in their minds. The comments, the assumptions, the certainty. One realization connected all of them. Nobody had questioned Malcolm because of his behavior. They had questioned him because of what they believed he represented. That thought grew heavier with every passing second. Robert finally turned toward the room. Many years ago, he said, our company faced decisions that shaped its future. He paused. Some of the most important decisions came from one individual who believed the airline industry could serve people better than it did at the time. The room remained silent. Robert looked toward Malcolm once more. That individual invested not only resources, but vision. Several staff members nodded. They knew exactly where the story was heading. Most passengers did not. Not yet. Lauren stared at Malcolm without blinking. Robert smiled warmly. There is a reason so many executives know Mr. Hayes personally. He paused again. The anticipation became almost unbearable. There is a reason his name immediately reaches leadership. Another pause. Every eye in the lounge remained fixed on him. Then Robert delivered the sentence that would completely change how everyone viewed the quiet man sitting beside the windows. Because Malcolm Hayes is not simply one of our guests. The words echoed through the lounge. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. And as dozens of people waited for the final piece of the truth, they realized that the story they had believed from the beginning was about to collapse completely. The silence inside the lounge became absolute. Every person in the room waited for Robert Sinclair to finish the sentence. Even travelers who had arrived only minutes earlier could feel the significance of the moment. Malcolm Hayes remained seated near the windows, calm and composed, while dozens of strangers stared in his direction. Robert smiled respectfully before continuing. Because Malcolm Hayes is one of the principal owners of the investment group that helped transform this airline into what it is today. The words seemed to stop time. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The businessman near the espresso station slowly lowered his eyes. The older woman by the window smiled as though a mystery had finally been solved. Several lounge employees exchanged knowing looks. They had understood pieces of the story. Now everyone else understood them too. Lauren Mitchell sat completely still. Her expression shifted from confusion to disbelief. She looked at Malcolm, then at Robert, then back at Malcolm again. The quiet man she had judged from across the room was not simply entitled to be there. He was one of the people responsible for helping build the very organization surrounding them. Robert continued speaking. Many of the improvements our customers enjoy today began with ideas Mr. Hayes championed years ago. Several employees nodded. The statement carried genuine respect. Not the respect given to wealth alone. The respect earned through leadership. Malcolm shook his head modestly. Many people contributed. Robert smiled. That sounds exactly like something you would say. Soft laughter spread through the room. The tension that had dominated the afternoon began dissolving, replaced by reflection. Passengers replayed the entire sequence of events in their minds. The assumptions, the whispers, the confidence with which conclusions had been formed. Suddenly those conclusions felt much heavier. Lauren lowered her gaze. For the first time since entering the lounge, she seemed genuinely uncomfortable. Not because Malcolm had revealed power, because he had never attempted to. He had never mentioned his position, never demanded recognition, never used status to silence criticism. He had simply remained patient while everyone else revealed what they believed about him. That realization was difficult to ignore. Robert looked around the lounge. "One thing I have always admired about Mr. Hayes," he said, "is that he never asks people to treat him differently." Several staff members nodded again. The statement clearly reflected years of experience. He believes respect should be given before titles are known. The words settled across the room. Nobody argued. Nobody could. The lesson had already unfolded in front of them. Malcolm finally stood. The movement immediately drew attention, yet his expression remained unchanged. Calm, thoughtful, grounded. He looked exactly the same as he had before the revelation. The only thing that had changed was how everyone else saw him. The businessman approached and extended his hand. "Sir," he said quietly, "I think I owe you an apology for some assumptions I made." Malcolm shook his hand warmly. "We all make assumptions." The answer carried no bitterness, no accusation, just honesty. Around the lounge, other travelers appeared equally reflective. Some looked embarrassed. Others looked inspired. Lauren remained seated, watching silently. She seemed to understand that the afternoon had become about something much larger than access to an airport lounge. It had become about perception itself. Robert glanced toward the departure screens and smiled. "Your flight is still on time." Malcolm laughed softly. "Good. I would hate for all this attention to make me late." More laughter followed. The atmosphere finally relaxed. Yet one final moment remained. Because although the truth had been revealed, the most important lesson of the day was still waiting to be spoken. The lounge gradually returned to normal, but something important had changed. The departure screens continued updating flight information. Travelers gathered belongings. Staff resumed their routines. Yet the conversations unfolding throughout the room were no longer about lounge access or travel status. They were about assumptions. Malcolm Hayes stood near the windows for a moment, watching aircraft move across the runway beneath the evening sky. The sunlight had softened into warm shades of gold and orange. Behind him, dozens of people continued reflecting on everything they had witnessed. Robert Sinclair checked the time and smiled. "You should probably head toward your gate." Malcolm nodded. That is usually how air travel works. The comment earned another round of quiet laughter. The tension that once filled the room now felt distant. Even so, one conversation remained unfinished. Lauren Mitchell slowly stood from her chair and walked toward Malcolm. The lounge grew noticeably quieter again. Several travelers watched from a distance. Nobody interrupted. Lauren stopped a few feet away. For a moment, she seemed unsure how to begin. Earlier that afternoon, confidence had guided every word she spoke. Now humility had replaced certainty. "Mr. Hayes," she said quietly. Malcolm turned toward her. "Yes." Lauren took a slow breath. "I owe you an apology." The words came without hesitation, without excuses. "I made assumptions about you before I knew anything about you." Malcolm listened without speaking. Lauren continued. "The truth is, I decided where you belonged before I knew who you were." The honesty in her voice changed the atmosphere again. This was no longer a confrontation. It was a moment of accountability. Malcolm nodded thoughtfully. "Thank you for saying that." Lauren lowered her eyes briefly. "You had every reason to be angry." Malcolm smiled gently. "Maybe, but anger would not have changed anything." The answer lingered in the air. Several nearby travelers heard it and reflected on it immediately. Lauren looked surprised. "You are not upset?" Malcolm glanced around the lounge. What would that accomplish? Nobody had an answer. Not Lauren. Not the travelers listening nearby. Because everyone understood he was right. The lesson had never been about winning. It had never been about proving power. It had been about revealing character. Lauren nodded slowly. "I understand." Malcolm smiled. Then something good came from today. She returned the smile and stepped back. The moment ended not with humiliation, but with growth. Robert watched quietly from a distance. So did David Mercer. Both understood that the most powerful part of the afternoon was not the reveal. It was the response. Malcolm could have used his position to embarrass people. Instead, he chose grace. As boarding time approached, travelers began collecting bags and preparing to leave. The businessman who had observed much of the afternoon shook Malcolm's hand. The older woman thanked him for the lesson she felt she had witnessed. Several staff members wished him a pleasant flight. Through it all, Malcolm remained exactly the same person he had been when he first entered the lounge. Calm, respectful, grounded. Before leaving, he paused near the entrance and looked back once toward the room. Many of the people inside were still watching him, not because of his title, not because of his success, because of what he had demonstrated. Then he spoke one final sentence. Not loudly, not dramatically, simply enough for those nearby to hear. Belonging is not decided by appearances. It is revealed by character. Silence followed. Not an uncomfortable silence. A thoughtful one. The kind that appears when people recognize a truth they cannot ignore. Moments later, Malcolm picked up his bag and walked toward his gate. The lounge doors closed behind him. The room slowly returned to normal. But for many of the people who had witnessed that afternoon, normal would never look quite the same again.